rwandais, mais un désastre africain et panafricain et même panhumain. Merci. Maintenant, la parole est... je fais appel à Monsieur Mathias Petway. Est-ce qu'il est là? Ah ben pardon, parce que oui, mais vous avez changé de place. Oui, enchanté, ravi. Bon, alors, le sujet de votre intervention est en anglais, The Genesis of Black Cuban Literature, Part 2. And you are teaching in University of South Alabama. You have the possibility to speak with us, and thank you.
Thank you. The microphone, is it on now? Okay. Okay. Udi mudakhaleti ilia walidatai. I dedicate this lecture to my mothers, Umara and Hassana, Gloria. I want to thank the Academy of the Kingdom of Morocco for the invitation. I neglected to do so yesterday, but I am very happy to be here and to give the second half of my lecture, The Birth of Black Cuban Literature, a lecture in 2 parts. In 1839, Juan Francisco Manzano became acquainted with Gabriel de la Concepcion Valdez, alias Plácido, at a Cuban cockfight, a quintessentially masculine pursuit among the lower social orders in the Caribbean. Plácido was born free in 1809 of a Spanish mother and a father of African and European descent, and he was quickly becoming the most prolific and notorious 19th century Cuban poet. When both men became acquainted, Plácido had already been arrested in 1838 for writing a seditious poem called La Sombra de Padilla, The Spirit of Padilla. The Spirit of Padilla is an ode to the Queen Regent that devolves into an anti-slavery poem fomenting ideas of Cuban liberty. Plácido encounters the Roman goddess Libertas, and he is anointed the standard bearer of Cuban freedom. I will quote first in Spanish and then in English. Pues vale más ser presa de la parca que privado de un déspota monarca. It is better to be victim of the grave than to be dispossessed by a despotic monarch, end quote. The revolutionary impulse of the spirit of Padilla created an unambiguous political choice for Plácido, freedom or martyrdom. This political binary would become one of the defining features of Plácido's revolutionary poetry. In his groundbreaking book, Por una Cuba Negra, Literatura, Raza y Modernidad en el Siglo XIX, Black Cuban scholar Alberto Abreu Arcia remarked that, quote, as a result, the Haitian Revolution and the Black Terror would be the 2 elements that shaped the racial politics of whitening that was devised to balance out the high African demographic on the island, end quote. In this political environment, Manzano's and Plácido's camaraderie had political consequences for both authors, consequences that made them enemies of the state. In this lecture, I will demonstrate that the Black Terror, Miedo al Negro, not only informed how free Black Cuban poets like Plácido and Cristina Ayala engaged literature, but also how the colonial state responded to this emerging poetics of emancipation. A year after their fortuitous meeting, Plácido and Manzano made their literary debut in Madrid and London, respectively. Spanish Romantic writer Jacinto Sales y Quiroga marveled at Plácido's political audacity in poems such as La Sombra de Padilla, The Spirit of Padilla, and La Profecía de Cuba a España, the prophecy from Cuba to Spain. And in that same year, Irish abolitionist Richard Robert Madden published Manzano's slave narrative in London in English translation, along with a lengthy dossier of his own materials, which he presented to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, and again in Paris in 1842. Manzano and Plácido were the most significant Black Cuban colonial authors because they ushered in the advent of Black Cuban writing in the global imagination. Plácido was a poet of the people. His improvisations, decimas, fables, epigrams, and letrillas reached Cubans without formal access to written practices of literacy. His parody relied on memorable refrains, Cuban argot, and a disarming capacity to evoke laughter in his audiences. In his epigram, Si a todos Arsino dices, if Arsino says to everyone, he mocks the Cuban mulatto, or person of mixed ancestry, who wants to be white. I will quote in Spanish first and then in English. Si a todos Arsino dices que son de baja ralea, cuando tienen a Guinea en el pelo y las narices, debes confesar, Arsino, que es desatino probado, siendo de vidrio el tejado, tirar piedras al vecino. If Arsino says to everyone that they are from the lower caste, when they possess Guinea in their hair and their nostrils, Arsino, you should confess it's proven nonsense to throw stones at your neighbor when the roof is made of glass. The texture of one's hair and the shape and slope of one's nose function as cultural signifiers of racial difference in if Arsino says to everyone, thus demonstrating that the mulatto's denial of African heritage is demonstrably false. Plácido situates the mulatto's cultural heritage in Guinea. Guinea comes from Guinea, a word of Portuguese origin referring to Africa during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Phenotype, skin color, hair texture, the law, Spanish colonial law, social status, and ancestry determined race in colonial Cuba. But Plácido constituted an even greater threat to what little remained of the Spanish Empire in the mid-19th century, because his work constituted what the government called, quote, una poética alusiva a planes contrarios a la tranquilidad y seguridad de esta isla, a poetics alluding to plans contrary to the tranquility and security of the island. In 1844, Gabriel de la Concepción Valdez, or Plácido, was taken into custody for being the ringleader of, quote, la conspiración proyectada por la gente de color para el exterminio de la parte de la población blanca de esta isla. That is, the conspiracy devised by the people of color to exterminate the white population of this island. Manzano was also brought up on charges. Among the poems that would ultimately seal Plácido's fate was the infamous sonnet El Juramento, published in 1840, The Oath. So I will read the oath, which is a sonnet in Spanish first and then the English translation. A la sombra de un árbol empinado que está de un ancho valle a la salida, hay una fuente que a beber convida de su líquido puro y argentado. Allí fui yo por mi deber llamado, y haciendo altar la tierra endurecida, ante el sagrado código de la vida, extendidas mis manos he jurado, ser enemigo eterno de tirano, manchar si me es posible mis vestidos con su execrable sangre por mi mano, derramarla con golpes repetidos y morir a las manos de un verdugo si es necesario por romper el yugo. In the shadow of a towering tree that stands at the end of an ample valley, there is a fount that bids you drink its pure and silvery water. There I went by my duty called, making an altar of the hardened earth before the sacred code of life. My hands extended, I have sworn an oath to be the eternal enemy of the tyrant, if it is possible, to tarnish my vestments with his detestable blood by my hand, shedding it with repeated blows, and dying at the hands of an executioner, if need be, to break the yoke. The oath represents an emerging poetics of emancipation in Black Cuban literature for three reasons. It swore an oath of secrecy among Blacks. It professed a sacred code of life reminiscent of African religious confraternities or organizations known in Spanish as cabildos, and it prophesied the execution of the queen. The altar of hardened earth is reminiscent of Bakongo Cuban conception of the natural world found in Manzano's poem Un sueño a mi segundo hermano, a dream to my second brother, because the wilderness is a sanctuary to commune with African divine spirits, in Pungus, in Kikongo, and Orishas in Yoruba, and ancestors as well. Cuban scholar Lidia Cabrera explained, quote, the ceiba tree is an altar to Palo Monte practitioners that deposit sacred items beneath the tree to absorb the virtue of its shadow, la sombra. In Plácido's poem, the tree is not an altar per se, but its sacred silhouette creates space for insurgents to swear oaths of retribution against slave society. Plácido's altar beckoned a new political order where African descendants might reject the authority of Queen Isabel II, Queen Isabel II, who ruled between 1833 and 1868. When she first came to power, she was merely a child. So her mother, Maria Cristina, ruled in her stead. The tree and the hardened earth are nature metaphors that establish Cuba, not Spain, as Plácido's patria, as Plácido's fatherland. Oaths inhabit the intersection between religion and politics. They constitute a social and political covenant between diverse interlocutors within a given polity. Italian theorist Giorgio Agamben points out that political crises arise when either party disregards or dishonors the oath they have sworn. Plácido's oath, quote, to tarnish my vestments with his detestable blood, end quote, he misgendered the queen, was a revolutionary speech act articulated in a subtle but formidable African-Cuban religious discourse. The emerging anti-slavery aesthetic in Plácido's poetry constituted what Egyptian Palestinian scholar Edward Said said, called a systematic conversion of the power relationship between the controller and the controlled. The judgment against Plácido and other leaders of the 1844 movement is a self-legitimating racial narrative devised to preserve Cuba as the ever-faithful possession of the Spanish Catholic monarchy. The administering of loyalty oaths as integral to the government's portrayal of Plácido as a subversive, and when read closely, provides clues about the spiritual ethos that informed his emancipatory project. This passage from the trial record when Plácido was placed on trial as the leader of the 1844 movement, though some scholars dispute that he was the leader, demonstrates or describes the political function of loyalty oaths. I will quote in Spanish first and then in English. Desde entonces vemos cooperar en el proceso estas razas unidas para llevar a cabo su inicuo proyecto. Se ensancha el círculo de la Junta, creando una otra secundaria de la clase de morenos en la casa de Marco Ruiz y Manuel Quiñones, vemos asimismo probado por declaraciones suficientes la concurrencia de algunos pardos a ella, miembros estos de la principal anteriormente ensalada, que Plácido en ella y Pimienta en otros puntos recibían horrendos juramentos al individuo que se iniciaba, pues fuese negro o pardo, sobre el exterminio de todo blanco y el de guardar el mayor sigilo, negando en el caso de ser sorprendidos. English translation. From that point on, we saw the cooperation of the two races, blacks and mulattoes were considered different races, united in the process to carry out their iniquitous project. They broadened the circle of the rebel junta, creating second-tier agents from the class of free blacks in the home of Marco Ruiz and Manuel Quiñones. This is proven by ample testimony regarding the participation of some mixed-race persons on the rebel junta, members of the original chief junta that was previously established with Plácido and Pimienta sitting on it, and at other points in time they administered horrendous oaths to individuals that were initiated, whether they were black or of mixed race, regarding the extermination of all whites and to guard the greatest caution, denying the plot in case they were discovered. As he had already testified, Plácido acknowledged having attended the gathering at Jorge Lopez's residence, but he feigned ignorance. He pretended to be ignorant about what had taken place among those gathered. Plácido wrote en la comida de la casa de Jorge López, en que se dice que hubo un juramento, bien pudo ser, pero dije entonces y repito ahora que no oí tal juramento. A mí me propuso un brindis sin decirme a qué, y yo no quise aceptar. In English, they say there was an oath at the dinner in the home of Jorge Lopez. There may have been, but I said then and I repeat now that I didn't hear any such oath. They made a toast without telling me what it was for, and I didn't consent. Plácido denied that he had administered oaths or received them from another party to disguise the existence of an African-descended political force, a polity that would deny white hegemony, that would defy white hegemony. But the testimony against Plácido suggests otherwise. Plácido and Juan Francisco Manzano did not enjoy the anonymity that may have protected their spoken word counterparts from political prosecution and arrest because they had published extensively in Spanish. 40 years following the triumph of the only revolution engineered by enslaved persons, the Spanish dreaded that Cuba too might become black and African, in a word, Haitian. The military government scoured the free population of color in search of the movement's intellectual leaders, and a small, though culturally significant, African-descended artisan and professional class fell under suspicion as agents and agitators of conspiracy. The authorities charged Manzano with aiding and abetting a conspiracy to abolish slavery and to oppose the regime. But the charges levied against Gabriel de la Concepción Valdez, Plácido, were far more severe. Plácido was convicted of being the president, mastermind, and recruiter of an insidious plot to exterminate white inhabitants and to institute a republic of blacks and mulattoes on the island. Though Manzano would survive the gruesome ordeal, on June 28, 1844, colonial authorities executed Plácido on charges of treason, having him shot in the back. This nascent poetics of emancipation would take on what Maria Aguilar Donelles calls, quote, a discourse of reclamation of heroic figures in the late 19th and early 20th century poetry of Cristina Ayala. In 1856, Cristina Ayala was born into slavery in Guines, Cuba, 12 years after Plácido's untimely execution at the hands of the colonial state. Ayala's freedom was purchased through a practice called coartación, self-purchase. Ayala published Ofrendas Mayebequinas in 1927, a collection of her writings between 1886 and 1925. The book explored the rights of Black Cubans and created space for Black female literary writers. In 1906, Ayala published a poem called Rejoinder, Contestación, only 4 years after Cuba gained independence from the Spanish Empire. According to historians, Black men were the overwhelming majority of Cuban independence fighters, constituting 70% of the Mambises, or Cuban revolutionary fighters, in the 19th century. I'm not referring to the Cuban Revolution, but the Cuban Wars for Independence that began in 1868 and ultimately triumphed in 1898, though the United States unfortunately intervened and did damage to Cuban sovereignty. Ayala reconfigures the poetics of emancipation portrayed in the works of Manzano, Plácido, and Antonio Medina. Antonio Medina was co-founder of the Black Cuban Press. For the sake of time, I'll read the English translation only of her poem, Contestación. In this poem, she acknowledges Black Cuban writers that came before her. The father of the Black Cuban Press, Antonio Medina, he's one of the co-founders of the press, and Manzano and Plácido. And so we see an instance of Black women and Black men working in unison for the betterment of what she called mi raza en Cuba, my race in Cuba. Quote, in Cuba today, my race, the doors to the temple of knowledge are open. It is logical to believe that if any genius in mighty flight wants to reach the glory of the heavens, can now achieve it. If in the times of the inhumane whip, Cuba gave us a Plácido, a Medina, and a Manzano, who in the midst of misfortune with such sweetness sang that the world was astonished. Remember Manzano and Plácido's work reached Madrid, London, and Paris. And later, Plácido's work reached the United States, and all throughout Latin America it was published. Mexican editions, Argentine editions. In conclusion, Ayala reimagines knowledge acquisition as the defining feature of Black Cuban progress in a post-emancipation society. Writing 4 years after Cuban independence from Spain, Cristina Ayala reiterates the significance of epistemology, and she inspires Black Cubans to channel the genius within. There is a conscious sense of literary tradition in Contestación, in Rejoinder, because the Black authors Ayala mentions were conversant in each other's work, and they sustained a rigorous intellectual dialogue. They even dedicated poems to one another. In the times of the humane whip, as Ayala writes, Antonio Medina paid homage to Plácido and Manzano by reprinting their poetry in El Rocío in 1856. The Black Cuban Press dedicated and named 3 newspapers for revolutionary poet Plácido in Palma Oriente, in Matanzas, and in Santa Clara in 1892 and 1889. Santa Clara, Che Guevara is mentioned in the famous song. Santa Clara is mentioned in the famous song about Che Guevara. Cristina Ayala compared, in her 1912 poem, In the Breach, in La Brecha, Cristina Ayala compared the brave warrior, El Bravo Guerrero, of the Black Mambi liberating army with the eminent man or woman of letters, literato eminente. In conclusion, Black Cuban literature emerged at the crossroads of disparate aesthetic traditions. It incorporated anti-slavery sentiments, advocated for revolution, ridiculed anti-Blackness with a touch of humor, questioned the oppression of Black women, and asserted the heroism of Black manhood. Ultimately, it sought to reimagine the possibilities of Black Cuban life. Merci beaucoup. Shukran.
Merci, Dr. Matthew Pietui, for this presentation of blackness, speaking English and Spanish.
I hope people understood. So
Spanish.
we have a professor who's going to provide
Non, je voudrais
phrase.
je voudrais juste dire en 2-3 mots de quoi il était question. Il est question de la périodicité de la littérature noire à Cuba, de la naissance de la littérature noire à Cuba, à partir de 2 auteurs, déjà pendant l'occupation de Cuba par l'Espagne, et comment ces 2 auteurs ont revendiqué leur appartenance à la culture, à l'identité, revendiquer leur identité africaine contre toute l'oppression qu'on essayait de leur opposer, et qu'ensuite il y a eu une 2e génération, la prochaine génération, qui est leur fille, la next generation, Cristina Ayala, n'est-ce pas, cette génération-là, et qui a mené la bataille encore plus loin. Et aujourd'hui, c'est pour cela qu'aujourd'hui, à Cuba, il y a une véritable tradition d'une littérature noire descendante d'Afrique qui revendique une identité contre toutes les oppressions et contre tout ce qui a été fait pour les empêcher de revendiquer cette tradition et de revendiquer cette périodicité de la littérature noire cubaine.
Oui, merci.
Vous m'avez permis de laïuser là-dessus, mais bon, votre laïus est vraiment très très clair. Et puis, évidemment, moi, j'allais dire qu'il nous introduit à une négritude version, n'est-ce pas, cubaine, parlant espagnol. Et ça, c'est un autre thème très très important. Maintenant, la parole est au public. S'il y a des questions à poser aux différents intervenants, n'hésitez pas.